A letter showed up at the door, not in someone's email, not through a middleman on the phone. Delivered by courier. Thick envelope. The kind you only use when you want someone to feel important before they open it. Embossed logo. Legal firm out of Seattle. Jeremy Clarkson turned it over in his hands, half expecting it to be some tedious corporate correspondence about rights fees or broadcast licensing. What he found inside made him laugh first, then made him genuinely furious. Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, philanthropist turned planetary problem solver, and the fourth wealthiest person on Earth, wanted to purchase Diddley Squat Farm. The offer on the table, £50 million for Clarkson's Oxfordshire property. Nearly 3 times what any estate agent in the Cotswolds would put on it. Clarkson read every word twice. Then he picked up a pen, wrote 2 words on the letter, and sent it straight back. Absolutely not. He had no idea that those 2 words were about to ignite something. Because Bill Gates doesn't hear no very often. And on the rare occasion that he does, he tends to find other routes to the same destination. Wind back to 2008. That's when Clarkson actually bought Diddley Squat, not 2019, as some reports have it. What happened in 2019 was simpler. The local contractor who'd been farming the land on Clarkson's behalf since the purchase retired. He'd been growing barley, rapeseed, and wheat, a standard Cotswolds arable rotation, and doing it competently for years. When he hung up his boots, Clarkson found himself staring at roughly 1,000 acres, around 400 hectares, of prime Oxfordshire farmland, with absolutely no idea what to do with it. The farm sits near the village of Chadlington, about 2 miles outside the market town of Chipping Norton, deep in the Cotswolds area of outstanding natural beauty. The landscape there is quintessentially English. Dry stone walls, rolling hills, narrow lanes worn down by centuries of cart traffic. It's the kind of land that photographs beautifully and farms brutally. Every crop carries weather risk. Every decision that's obvious to a seasoned farmer is completely invisible to someone who's spent his career reviewing sports cars on a racetrack. Clarkson named the farm Diddley Squat himself. It was a joke about its productivity, which said quite a lot about how he approached the whole venture. He didn't come in pretending to know what he was doing. He came in with a camera crew, a tractor he immediately crashed, and a young farm manager named Kaleb Cooper, who was born and raised in Chipping Norton, and quietly turned out to be the most competent person on the property. The show that came out of all this, Clarkson's Farm, premiered on Amazon Prime Video in June 2021, and became something few people predicted. An enormous cultural phenomenon. People who'd never shown any interest in agriculture sat down and binged the whole thing. Something about watching a man who was visibly out of his depth, genuinely, not performatively, trying to keep a working farm alive, resonated in a way that polished countryside documentaries never had. It made farming feel real, difficult, costly, occasionally heartbreaking, and weirdly important. Clarkson, almost by accident, had become British agriculture's most effective advocate, but while he was learning the difference between a direct drill and a cultivator, something else was taking shape across the British countryside. Something quieter, something significantly better funded. Foreign investment in British farmland isn't new. For decades, pension funds, institutional investors, and overseas buyers had been treating UK agricultural land as a stable, long-term asset. And it is stable. Farmland rarely crashes. It doesn't sit empty. And in a world where population keeps climbing and food supply increasingly doesn't, productive land only goes one direction in value. But what started happening around 2021 was different in scale. Vast tracts of English farmland began changing hands in blocks, hundreds of acres at a time, purchased through holding companies and investment vehicles with names that told you absolutely nothing about who was writing the checks. Shell companies, investment trusts, corporate structures layered on top of each other specifically to obscure beneficial ownership. One name kept surfacing in farming community whisper networks. Land agents who handled these transactions talked. Solicitors in market towns talked. And what they said, quietly, was Bill Gates. This wasn't exactly a secret in America. Gates had been buying farmland through his private investment firm, Cascade Investment, since as far back as 2013. By 2025, according to the land report, he'd accumulated roughly 275,000 acres across 17 U.S. states, making him the largest private farmland owner in the country. The holdings stretched from the wheat fields of eastern Washington to soybean country in Louisiana, with significant concentrations in Arizona, Nebraska, Illinois, and Florida. 2 deals alone, a purchase from the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board and the 100 Circles acreage in eastern Washington, came to an estimated $690 million. In Nebraska, he holds 20,000 acres spread across 19 counties, acquired for around $113 million. The financial logic isn't complicated. Over the past 8 decades, U.S. farmland prices increased roughly 6-fold in real terms. It's an inflation-resistant, tangible asset that produces an essential commodity. Professional investment managers understand that even a modest yield from an enormous land portfolio compounds into extraordinary returns over time. Gates's team at Cascade had spotted this early. They weren't unusual in recognizing the opportunity, but they moved with a scale that left everyone else in the dust. When Gates was pressed about it during a Reddit AMA session in 2023, he was characteristically blunt. "I own less than 1/4000th of the farmland in the U.S. I have invested in these farms to make them more productive and create more jobs. There isn't some grand scheme involved. In fact, all these decisions are made by a professional investment team. 1/4000th of something enormous is still an enormous amount." And critics had already started pointing out a pattern that went beyond passive investment. Gates's portfolio of interests included stakes in agricultural technology companies, synthetic biology firms, plant-based protein ventures, and organizations pushing for large-scale agricultural transformation. The farmland, to some analysts, didn't look like a neutral investment. It looked like infrastructure. Whether that reading was fair or paranoid depended entirely on who you asked. By 2021, Gates-linked entities had begun acquiring farms in and around Oxfordshire. Not in Gates's name, through the usual maze of corporate intermediaries, but the farming community in that part of the Cotswolds is tight-knit, and land agents talk. Patterns emerged. By 2022, 3 farms within 5 miles of Diddley Squat had been absorbed into corporate ownership traceable back to Gates-linked funds. Then 2 more. Then 4 more. It wasn't random. Someone was working a map, picking off properties in a deliberate sequence, building out coverage of the area farm by farm. Clarkson started pulling on threads. He made calls. He talked to neighbors, to land agents, to solicitors who'd handled the transactions. What he assembled was a picture much larger than Oxfordshire. Thousands of acres of English farmland quietly shifting from independent ownership into a single corporate constellation. In 2023, the farm sharing a direct boundary with Diddley Squat went up for sale. Clarkson considered buying it himself. He lost the bidding, not by a narrow margin, but by a massive one. The winning buyer was a corporate entity he'd never encountered. Research traced it straight back to a Gates-linked investment vehicle. Bill Gates was now his immediate next-door neighbor. A few months after that transaction completed, the first approach came. Not a formal offer, just a feeler. An American investment firm expressing vague interest in potential future acquisition opportunities regarding Diddley Squat. Clarkson filed it under ignored. The second approach arrived 3 months later. More direct this time. A formal offer of £20 million for the farm. At a generous estimate, Diddley Squat was worth around £15 million on the open market. This was a deliberate overpayment, the kind of premium that signals the buyer doesn't need the property to pencil out financially. They want it for other reasons. Clarkson declined politely, but without ambiguity. Not interested in selling. 6 months on, a third approach. £35 million. Clarkson's response was less diplomatic than the first time. "I've said no. Please stop asking." They didn't stop. January 2024. A fourth formal approach. £45 million. This time packaged with detailed documentation about what the buyers described as a strategic agricultural development opportunity. Clarkson read the language carefully. It talked about strategic consolidation, optimizing land use, sustainable intensification. Translation: Gates wanted to build something large-scale and industrialized. Diddley Squat was the missing piece. Clarkson's written reply was blunt. "My farm is not part of your land portfolio strategy. I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. Stop contacting me about this." March 2024 brought the £50 million offer, the one that arrived by courier, with the embossed envelope and the Seattle legal letterhead. But this one was different in a key way. For the first time, it named Bill Gates explicitly. Previous approaches had stayed behind corporate language. This one acknowledged who was really behind all of it. And it came with what amounted to a veiled warning. This was the final offer. If declined, the surrounding properties would be developed in ways that could make Clarkson's own farming operations significantly more complicated. That last paragraph was the one that got under his skin. This wasn't a purchase offer anymore. It was a pressure tactic. Accept £50 million and walk away from the life you've built here, or turn it down and watch what happens to everything around you. Clarkson wrote his two-word reply by hand, sent it back the same afternoon. Then he did the one thing Gates's team had presumably not planned for. He went to the press. April 2024. Clarkson wrote a column in the Sunday Times titled, "Why I Told Bill Gates to Sod Off." It laid out everything: the sequence of approaches, the escalating offers, the implied threat in the final letter, and the broader context of Gates-linked corporate entities systematically purchasing farmland across Britain. He didn't editorialize much. He let the timeline speak for itself. The column detonated. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared millions of times, leading news bulletins, dominating social media. Not just because it was Clarkson, though his platform certainly amplified it. It hit something deeper. This wasn't just a story about a famous man and his farm. It was about something that had been happening quietly across Britain's countryside for years, and that most people had either not noticed or not understood the full scale of. Foreign capital, sometimes American, sometimes from the Middle East, sometimes from other sources entirely, had been absorbing British farmland at a pace that alarmed anyone who tracked it closely. The economic logic was identical to what Gates's team had spotted in America. Land is finite. Food is essential. Prices trend upward over decades. For large institutional investors, British farmland was a compelling asset class. For the farming families who'd worked those fields for generations, it looked completely different. Gates's communications team issued a measured response. These were routine property investments. They supported sustainable agriculture. They were consistent with climate initiatives. Nothing to see here. Clarkson hit back within the hour on social media. Sustainable agriculture? You're building industrial megafarms. That's not sustainable. That's corporate control of the food supply dressed up in green language. The public sided with the man on the tractor. May 2024. Having failed on straight purchase, Gates's side tried a different angle, a joint venture proposal. Clarkson could retain formal ownership while they provided capital investment and took a share of profits and operational control. The economic upside would be considerable. The legal ownership would stay with him. He could see exactly what that meant. You get control without buying it. Still no. Then things turned practical. Planning applications began appearing for large-scale developments on the Gates-owned farms surrounding Diddley Squat. Industrial storage buildings for agricultural machinery, processing facilities, research and development structures, each one individually defensible, all properly submitted, all accompanied by detailed environmental assessments, all handled by expensive planning lawyers. None of them individually looked like harassment. Collectively, they looked like a blueprint for making small-scale farming on Diddley Squat as difficult as possible. Noise, heavy vehicle traffic, light pollution from large facilities running at all hours. The specific type of disruption that chips away at rural farming life without giving you anything concrete to fight in court. June 2024. The first application got through. A substantial warehouse facility for agricultural equipment storage and processing, positioned on the property sharing a boundary with Clarkson's fields. Construction began almost immediately. The trucks were constant. The noise carried. Clarkson's sheep were visibly stressed. Filming for the show became logistically complicated. The tranquil farmland atmosphere that had been part of what made the series work, that sense of a real working farm at a human scale, was being methodically dismantled from the edges. He complained to the council, was told everything was lawfully permitted. Which it was. July 2024. A second application approved. A research and development center for sustainable farming technology. More construction, more disruption, same message. We can do this all day. Sell, or accept that your farming life becomes permanently difficult. Clarkson didn't sell. He did what he always does when things get complicated. He pointed a camera at it. August 2024. Clarkson's farm returned for its fourth series, and the corporate farmland story ran through it like a thread. He didn't name Gates by name. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The series followed his attempts to keep farming productively while surrounded by an expanding industrial operation on every side, the chaos of planning disputes, the stress on his livestock, the economics of trying to run a small-scale farm inside a rapidly closing corporate perimeter. The opening episode drew 30 million viewers. The hashtag #SaveBritishFarms trended globally for 2 days. Farmers from Cornwall to Aberdeenshire flooded social media with their own accounts of corporate pressure on their land, offers they'd received, applications filed on neighboring properties, the slow squeeze that forced families who'd farmed the same ground for 3 or 4 generations to eventually sell. Gates had wanted this kept quiet. Clarkson had made it a national conversation. September 2024. In a rare move, Gates gave a lengthy interview defending his agricultural investments. He made the case that feeding a global population of 8 billion, heading toward 10 billion, requires innovation at scale. That the model of small family farms, however romantic, cannot produce sufficient yields to meet coming food demand. That his investments supported research into crop science, water efficiency, and climate-resilient agriculture. That the opposition from people like Clarkson was essentially sentiment dressed up as principle. Clarkson's column response was short. If you're worried about the climate, stop flying private jets. If you want to help farmers, stop buying their farms. To understand why this fight matters beyond one Oxfordshire farm, you need to understand what's been happening to agricultural land across the Western world for the past 2 decades. Farmland has become one of the most sought-after asset classes among ultra-high net worth investors and institutional funds. The return profile is almost uniquely attractive. Consistent annual returns averaging around 5% net of inflation over the past 30 years, virtually zero correlation to stock market volatility, and a tangible, finite resource that becomes more strategically valuable as populations grow. You can't manufacture more farmland. You can print more money. You can't print more topsoil. What began as a quiet repositioning of institutional investment portfolios turned, over time, into a structural transformation of who owns the land that produces food. In the United States, more than 80% of farmland is currently owned by someone over the age of 55, with half of that held by people over 75. That means an estimated 400 million acres of American farmland will change hands within the next decade as the current generation of farm owners ages out. Institutional buyers are already positioned. Family farms often aren't. In Britain, the picture has its own specific complications. The October 2024 budget from the Starmer government included a proposal to subject farms worth more than £1 million to standard inheritance tax, scrapping an exemption that had existed since 1992. The government's stated rationale was preventing wealthy investors from using agricultural land purely as a tax shelter. The Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, pointed out that it had become the most effective way for the super-rich to avoid paying inheritance tax. The farming community saw it differently. On 19 November 2024, thousands of farmers descended on Parliament Square in London. Tractors blocked the streets around Westminster. Banners read, "No farmer, no food, no future." The National Farmers Union, not historically given to this kind of agitation, was openly hostile to the policy. The Country Land and Business Association estimated that roughly 70,000 farms, worth more than £1 million, could face a tax bill that most would only be able to meet by selling land. The perverse result, critics pointed out, was that a tax specifically designed to deter investment-driven land acquisition would most immediately hammer the working farmers it was supposed to protect. Family farms land-rich but cash-poor would face inheritance demands they couldn't meet. Corporate investors, who don't die and don't pass assets through personal estates, would sail through unaffected. And waiting in the wings, with substantial capital and established infrastructure for absorbing British farmland, were exactly the kind of institutional buyers the policy was ostensibly targeting. It was into this already volatile atmosphere that Clarkson's fight arrived. His platform let him amplify something farmers across the country had been experiencing quietly for years. The column in the Sunday Times, the television series, the social media presence, all of it gave the story oxygen it never had when it was just a succession of planning notices and companies' house searches in rural market towns. October 2024. More Gates-linked acquisitions completed around Chipping Norton. By this point, Diddley Squat's 1,000 acres existed as something close to an island, independent farmland entirely encircled by properties held, one step removed, by the same investor. New offers arrived in sequence. £60 million. Then £70 million. Clarkson ignored each one. Then came a different category of pressure. Environmental and land management organizations, some with verifiable financial connections to the Gates Foundation, began filing formal complaints about Diddley Squat's agricultural practices, water usage, livestock management, land stewardship. Each complaint was individually minor. Each one required time, legal attention, and money to address through the proper regulatory channels. None of them resulted in any meaningful finding against the farm. All of them consumed resources and energy that Clarkson would rather have put into actual farming. He recognized the pattern. It's a classic legal attrition strategy, not winning through any single action, but grinding down an opponent through the cumulative cost of responding to many small ones. November 2024. He'd had enough of fighting it privately. He called a press conference at the farm, stood in front of the cameras on his own land, surrounded by his own fields, and said what he needed to say. Bill Gates wants British farmland. I understand why. Land is valuable. Food production is power. But British agriculture isn't a monopoly board for billionaires to play with. This is our food, our land, our heritage, and I am not selling. The statement ran globally. Gates's team responded that the criticism was unfounded and that the investments served innovation and sustainability. The back and forth was now a fixture of the news cycle. December 2024. A Gates-linked fund quietly acquired the village pub near Diddley Squat through yet another shell company. Ownership only became traceable after patient corporate registry searches. The symbolism was naked. I can buy anything around you. Sooner or later, you'll give up. Clarkson's counter was characteristic. He opened his own pub on the farm, called it the Peasants Revolt. The menu included a dish named Billionaire's Comeuppance. January 2025. The individual farmers who'd been quietly dealing with similar pressure started coming forward publicly. What Clarkson had surfaced as a local dispute turned out to be a national pattern. Gates-linked entities had accumulated over 40,000 acres across England, stitched together into a loose network of corporate-controlled farms operating at a scale no individual family holding could compete with. The pressure tactics Clarkson described, escalating offers, planning applications strategically positioned to cause disruption, bureaucratic complaints draining time and money, were familiar to farmers in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Kent, and Somerset. Clarkson organized a gathering. Farmers from across the country came to Diddley Squat for a meeting that grew into the formation of a formal coalition, Save British Family Farms. The campaign went viral within days. Petitions, protests outside constituency offices, direct lobbying of MPs. The kind of sustained political pressure that's hard to ignore when it comes from people who produce the country's food. February 2025. The issue reached Parliament. A debate on foreign and corporate ownership of British farmland was scheduled, with cross-party support. Gates's lobbying operation went into overdrive. Arguments about investment, innovation, agricultural transformation, the impracticality of restricting overseas capital. But the public mood had shifted noticeably. The debate was no longer primarily about whether large investors should be allowed to own farmland. It was about what happens to food security, rural communities, and national sovereignty when they do. March 2025. Bill Gates made one final personal move. He wrote a letter, handwritten, not from a legal firm, not from a corporate intermediary. From him, personally, to Clarkson. The offer inside, £100 million for a farm worth perhaps £15 million on the open market, 7 times its value, along with promises about preserving the farm's character, maintaining local employment, continuing agricultural operations in some form. Clarkson framed the letter and hung it on the wall of the Peasants Revolt. The caption underneath read, "When billionaires think everything has a price." His written response was published in the Times the following week. Mr. Gates, I know you're used to acquiring what you want. But Diddley Squat isn't for sale. Not for £100 million, not for £1 billion. This isn't about money. It's about principle. British farmland belongs to British farmers. not to foreign billionaires constructing agricultural monopolies from behind layers of shell companies. April 2025. Gates went quiet. No more offers. No further personal correspondence. But the construction and development on the surrounding properties continued. More facilities appearing. More heavy machinery. More enclosure. Clarkson adapted. He documented everything, made it all content, used the platform he'd accidentally built to keep the story in front of the people who needed to hear it. May 2025. A documentary filmmaker approached him. They wanted to make a full-length film about Gates's global farmland acquisition program, not just Oxfordshire, but the global picture. Gates's holdings in America, his foundation's agricultural interventions in Africa, the Ag1 initiative he'd funded with the stated aim of helping smallholder farmers, but which critics, including the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, had characterized as a vehicle for corporate seed and chemical dependency. Clarkson agreed to participate and handed over his complete documentation, every offer letter, every planning application, every corporate registry search connecting purchasing entities back to their ultimate beneficial owner. June 2025. The documentary, Farmland, The New Land Grab, premiered. It featured Clarkson prominently, but spread much wider. It interviewed farmers in North Dakota who'd faced the same kind of corporate buyout pressure. It talked to food sovereignty activists in Kenya and Ethiopia who'd watched Gates Foundation-backed agricultural programs reshape what their farming communities grew and how they grew it. It drew a line between the purchase of rural British pubs through shell companies and the global concentration of food system control in a small number of extraordinarily wealthy hands. 50 million people watched it. Gates's agricultural operations were suddenly the subject of international scrutiny at a scale no number of press releases or carefully worded Reddit answers could address. Gates gave a series of interviews in response. He defended the investment thesis, the foundation's agricultural work, the argument that innovation at scale is the only realistic answer to feeding 10 billion people. He characterized the opposition as anti-progress sentiment, masquerading as concern for farming heritage. Clarkson's response was 3 words: innovation isn't monopoly. Today, the standoff is static but unresolved. Gates controls thousands of acres circling diddly squat in every direction. Construction continues on the surrounding properties. The facilities that have appeared since 2024 have altered the character of the immediate landscape in ways that were clearly deliberate. Industrial-scale agriculture, arrived at through planning compliance rather than negotiation, has enclosed 1,000 acres of independent farmland on all sides. Clarkson farms his land, makes his television show, writes his columns, runs his pub, keeps putting a spotlight on something that most people in power would prefer stayed in the shadows. Neither has moved. Neither shows any sign of moving. The cameras cut to diddly squat. Clarkson on the tractor, working his fields inside the enclosure that now surrounds him, stubborn as the dry stone walls that line every road in this part of the Cotswolds. The cameras cut to Seattle, a man accustomed to solving problems with capital, encountering a problem that capital alone can't solve. What makes this fight unusual is that both sides believe they're right. Gates and his team genuinely appear to believe that large-scale, technology-driven agriculture is the only viable path to food security for a growing global population. The argument isn't without substance. Smallholder farming, as romantically appealing as it is, cannot feed 8 billion people without industrial support of some kind. But Clarkson's counterargument has its own substance. The question isn't whether agriculture needs to change, it's who gets to control that change, and whether the people whose families have worked the land for generations get any say in it at all. When a decision about what gets planted on British soil, or how water resources on that land get managed, or what processing infrastructure gets built in Oxfordshire villages, gets made in a corporate headquarters in Seattle rather than by a farmer standing in his own fields, something has shifted that goes beyond financial returns. Food is power, land is power. The concentration of both in the hands of people who aren't accountable to the communities that depend on them is a problem that doesn't have a clean answer. What Clarkson has done, perhaps more effectively than any policy paper or parliamentary debate, is make that problem visible. The farming community across Britain has been watching. Thousands of farmers in situations similar to Clarkson's, facing corporate offers they don't want to accept but can't afford to refuse indefinitely, surrounded by institutional buyers with bottomless patience, Look at what's happening at Diddley Squat and see something they need. Someone willing to absorb the pressure publicly rather than privately. Someone with a platform big enough that the pressure tactics don't work the same way. Someone, frankly, too famous and too stubborn to be quietly squeezed out. If Clarkson sells, the story ends. The surrounding farms stay in corporate ownership. The pressure on every neighboring independent farmer intensifies. The template gets reused in other English counties where the same acquisition pattern is already underway. He's not selling. Gates thought this was a financial problem with a financial solution. Raise the offer high enough, and eventually sentiment bends. That's how it usually works. Landowners are human. £100 million is an incomprehensible amount of money for a farm that earns a fraction of that over its entire productive lifetime. But Clarkson found something at Diddley Squat that he didn't go looking for. He found a purpose. The loudmouth television presenter who'd spent decades reviewing cars and annoying people turned out to be exactly what British agriculture needed in this particular moment. Somebody too public to be pressured quietly, too stubborn to be worn down, and too determined to calculate whether it's financially rational to keep going. Some things aren't for sale, not because the price isn't high enough, because selling them means something that no amount of money can make right. Welcome to Diddley Squat Farm. Still independent, still farming, still Clarkson's. The farmland Bill Gates couldn't buy. The farmer he couldn't beat. £100 million said otherwise. He was wrong.